It's a hot evening.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Bombs explode in the streets of European capitals. Populations and their governments are paralysed by fear of ideological terrorism. All the while, shady Russian operatives exploit these fears to sow seeds of discord, and forgers invent new stories from thin air to further their cause or discredit their opponents, disseminating them through technological channels that society hasn't quite got to grips with. Sound familiar? Then you must know your late 19th century history. This turbulent period is the setting for Marcel Theroux's stunning sixth novel, The Secret Books, which takes us from Tsarist Russia to Paris to British India and back again. It's a frenetic tale based on real events and populated with historical characters, specifically Russian writer and adventurer Nicolas Notovitch and Pyotr Rechkovsky, the head of the Parisian branch of Russian Secret Service, whose collaboration and rivalry is one of the several axles about which The Secret Books turns. And if you're wondering how much of The Secret Books is a fiction and how much fact, well, that's just as it should be. For above all else, it's also a masterful novel about stories, how they're told and who gets to tell them, what gives certain stories power, regardless of the falsehoods they contain, and what suppresses others, regardless of their truth. In addition to The Secret Books, Marcel Theroux is the author of the novels A Blow to the Heart, A Stranger in the Earth, The Paper Chase, which won the 2002 Somerset Maugham Award, Far North, which was shortlisted for America's prestigious National Book Award, and Strange Bodies. Novelist John Banville called The Secret Books ingenious and stylish, describing it as a meditation on our abiding need for stories, which itself has a gloriously entertaining story to tell. While philosopher John Gray declared The Secret Books the most compelling and exciting novel of ideas I've read for many years. Please join me in welcoming Marcel Theroux to Shakespeare and Company.
Thanks, Adam.
My pleasure. Well, I guess since we're in Paris, let's begin with the Paris you introduce us to in your novel. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about.
Sure, I came to Paris by a weird route. Actually, my initial what sparked the book was an obsession I had with biblical apocrypha. Specifically, I was interested in the question of what Jesus was doing in his missing years. As you know, in the Bible, there's a gap in the text. We don't really know what Jesus was doing between the ages of about 13 and 33. I always thought that was fascinating, and just in a sort of idly curious way, I followed various sort of shaggy dog stories about what he might have been doing, and one of them, you might be aware of this. One story holds that Jesus spent those years visiting Glastonbury with as many people of around the age do. The idea was that he went with Joseph of Arimathea and was involved in the tin trade and ended up in doing something in England, and from that we get the whole legend about Jerusalem, about William Blake, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, which is a great story and absolutely unprovable. There's another strand of I want to call it heresy, but I think apocrypha is probably kinder, which holds that in those years Jesus spent time in India studying Buddhism, possibly Hinduism, and achieved some status as a Buddhist a Buddhist monk. And I thought, that's an amazing, what a bizarre and kind of wonderful thought. I would absolutely love that to be true. I think the idea of a kind of ecumenical Jesus who travelled east and embraced other religions, and I think there is some. If you look at the Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels, she does discuss this, and she does suggest there is a shadow of older religions in early Christianity. I think that's a wonderful idea. And as I was exploring this idea quite a long time ago, close to 20 years ago, I discovered that one of the source materials for this story is an account by a Russian journalist stroke adventurer spy who was travelling in India in the 1880s, and in 1887 claimed that he went to a Buddhist monastery in Ladakh, now part of India but culturally Tibetan, and was shown a manuscript in an ancient language which contained a lost gospel, which was an account of Jesus' studies in India. And this was the source material. And Notovitch published this book in Paris in 1994, and I brought this along because I think it's quite thrilling, and there's not many of us, so we can pass it around as long as you promise not to take it away with you. But this is Notovitch's original book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, which he published in 1994, in Paris. It's falling apart. But if you want to have a look at that, it's quite, just be a little gentle. 18, what did I say? No, 1994. No, it's 1894. See how fake news gets into the record so easily. And I thought, what an amazing thing. How come no one knows about this book? How come no one knows who Nicolas Notovitch is? So I started doing research about Notovitch, and at one point I thought, well, maybe this is a non-fiction book. Actually, at one point I thought, maybe he really did find this manuscript, and maybe there's a monastery in Ladakh, in Hemis, was the monastery he named, where this manuscript still exists. And I actually have been to that monastery, and I could say with a 99% certainty that it doesn't exist, because I'm sure they would have shown it to me if they had it, or someone would have turned up. But there's still a 1%. I think there's a, let's maybe be generous and say there's a 5% chance that some record will emerge to vindicate his claim. But what I discovered, I think, is that Notovitch was writing his book for quite different reasons.
And those reasons, of course, are connected to his own life, but also a lot of the sort of the political situation at the time and the way certain tensions were being exploited by different.
That's exactly right.
Operatives.
And when you read, you can read this on the internet. It's translated in English and it exists in French. You can read it very easily. You don't have to get the 1894 edition. Even though it was a bestseller, I should say, when it first came out, it was a bestseller. It was translated into multiple languages, and so there's still the theory still has an afterlife on the internet. People still think, oh yeah, the Jesus in India story, which actually may have a different origin, but often when people are talking about it, they're referring to Notovitch's book. But when you read his book, which I have, you see that there's. The headline claim is that Jesus was a Buddhist, but the gospel actually does a couple of other interesting things. I think the most significant to me is that it absolves the Jewish people of their historical guilt of Jesus' crucifixion. Remember in the Bible, there's the famous scene in Matthew where Pilate hands Jesus over to the jurisdiction of the Jewish people. The Jewish people declare, his blood be on us and on our children. Pilate washes his hands. And what I didn't know when I started researching this was just how tenacious a calumny that was for Jewish people, just how much Christian anti-Semitism found its source in this allegation, which is actually only in Matthew. If you read the various Gospels, they all have slightly different versions of how Jesus meets his end and who's responsible for it. What's significant about Notovitch's version is that it's Pilate. It's the Jewish people say, let him go, and he has the scene that he gives the hand washing to the Jewish elders. They wash their hands and Pilate sentences him to death. And to me it seemed obvious that Notovitch was trying to adjust the historical record. He was trying to rewrite history and suggest another way of looking, suggesting an alt account of the crucifixion. And I think why this is pertinent to him is that he was Jewish himself, and he grew up in part of Russia, very on the Black Sea, very near Kerch, which has been in the news lately because Putin's just built an enormous bridge from Kerch to Crimea, so that this is a massive. They're very, very proud of this new bridge. Anyway, Notovitch grew up in this town, would have known firsthand of all the prejudice that Jews faced in Russia, which, if you don't know about, it's an astonishing and shocking history. But then subsequently, and I suppose this is what takes us to Paris in the 1880s, the other secret book that I was concerned with in writing this is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which some of you may have heard of, some of you won't. But in a way, what it is it's the great grandfather of all conspiracy theories. It's the forged account, purported account of a council held by Jewish elders in which they discussed their plans for world domination. And it was plagiarized, obviously, from a work by Maurice Joly, the French author. And I think the shocking thing about the Protocols is that to this day, there are people who think it's true, or there are people who hold it up as an accurate account of a conspiracy by Jewish people to control the media and the banks, and you can see it in discourse today. You can see it in on the internet today. You can see the impression it leaves on conversations we're having in 2018, which is so utterly bizarre because the book has been debunked so many times. It's like a vampire. How many times or a zombie, however many times you blow its head off with a 12 gauge, it gets right back up and marches on through history. And what was fascinating to me is looking into that book is that I realised it was most likely put together in Paris under the orders of the Russian secret police as a form of compromat, which is a word we all now know, which is a form of compromising material intended to discredit someone. In this case, intended to discredit an entire group of people, and was put together not far from here by the head of the Russian secret police in Paris, Pyotr Rachkovsky, also a Russian, also a converted Jew. And I can't prove this, which was why I guess this ends up being a novel. But it seemed to me very likely that Notovitch knew about this project, and what I suggest in the book is that his unknown life is actually is his attempt to shift the historical record. It's an antidote to the protocol. It's the anti-protocols.
In a sense, that sort of anticipates my next question about the sort of, because you said earlier this could have been a non-fiction book, and indeed, there plenty of non-fiction books have been written about this particular period because, of course, it encompasses the Dreyfus affair.
That's right.
As well. But I think the decision to write it as a novel, in some ways, is in harmony with the story that it wants to tell, actually, because there are so many unknowns, so many stories spun by different people, that the sort of the sense of what actually happened seems to have kind of got lost in the midst of time.
And that's exactly what became fascinated. That's what I became fascinated about, and I realised that was the sort of thing that was connecting the various threads. Was that. And it was a long time ago that I started writing this, but I was thinking we really don't believe things because of whether they're factually true, much as we like to think we do, and that we're rational. We believe things because they feel right, or because we're invested in certain narratives. And it seemed to be a time I noticed suddenly. I couldn't put a date on this, but I want to say around 2010. When the word narrative became a very people started using narrative in this sense to mean in this very specific way, and it's really a term from it has a very specific meaning, but people started to use it to where in another context you might use the word lie, actually, if you're going to be a bit more honest,
or at the very least spin, maybe,
spin. And I thought, well, this is one thing a novel can really show you is. I know something about how stories originate and how you manipulate people with stories, and that the modes of storytelling can be employed to dark ends. Mm-hmm. Because actually, my wife came back from a literary festival with a bag saying her stories are bridges to other worlds, right? And I thought, right, well, that's true, but that isn't the only thing that stories are. But we have, as writers, you're a novelist, and I write novels, and I'm sure people here all love reading novels, and we think that storytelling is a wonderful thing. But actually, there's a shadow side of storytelling, which is that it can be deceptive and vindictive, and it can be used to argue for a particular angle. So I wanted to sort of pay tribute to that in the book.
I'd like to talk a little bit more later about the sort of the relationship between history and storytelling, but specifically about the novel, because you could have again launched into it as a relatively straightforward historical novel, and yet that's not your approach at all. In fact, it's almost a sort of in the tradition of sort of I guess sort of portmanteau stories like the 1001 Nights or things like that. There's several layers of frame story.
Yes.
Before we get to it, and I'm intrigued by this decision. So we begin in essentially contemporary London.
Yes.
And then we take another step back in time to sort of the late 30s.
That's right.
In London.
And that's right. And it was, and I was feeling that. I did experiment with writing it as a straight historical novel one day in 1887. Nicolas Notovitch. I hope it would have been a bit better than this, but maybe, it was riding up to the monastery in Hemis and knocked on the door, and I kind of felt a great weariness come over me when I attempted that. I thought, well, I can't. I needed to find a way, because it seemed to me one thing that's really important about stories is who's telling it, and who is telling the story, and what's their agenda. It's I feel something that I feel like sort of by 2018 now it seemed a bit less obvious, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago, and so I wanted to sort of give my bona fides at the top of the book and say, look, this is me. I'm trying to write a book, and it's not that easy, and these are the ways that the manipulation happens. And I want to try and make a pact with the reader where I'm trying to be as truthful as I can with you, and create a kind of because I think that's one of the things novels really can do well. When an author really tries to, when you really feel this author is really in my head, I really tried to establish that sort of conspiracy, and then wind us back into the past. But I think that's sort of how but I think you know this too, that there's a moment when the calculation stops and something a bit more mysterious in fiction takes over. As I like to think of it, the difference between authenticity and enchantment. But there are books that are authentic, and you think this person really saw these things, and this person lived this life, and therefore the trust that this account is valuable for these reasons. And there's also there's that other thing that writers have, where you feel like this person is casting a magic spell on me, and I do not care whether they never saw this. It feels this is totally real to me. This is the magic by which a creation in someone's head transmits itself to mine. But that can also be a black magic, and that's, I suppose, what I want. That is the Rachkovsky who created the protocols. Was he also It's also an enchantment to persuade you that there's a conspiracy, and these people are manipulating you, and there's a cabal, and they want this, and they're going to do that, and that magic spell can be used for good and bad.
I think there's also something very interesting in the approach you take with the frame story, in that it is sort of almost begins with a demonstration of the kind of manipulation that can take place. I mean, I think of it, and it's a very minor example, but you introduce us to this character called Francis, and then after a few pages, you sort of, no, Francis just doesn't quite feel right, and Francis, maybe it'd be better if Francis was a woman, and then becomes Francesca, and then we continue the story with Francesca, and and quite comfortably as readers.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think there's a few things in the book that I think might be Marmite things, that which I'm not going to assume that there's a cosmopolitan enough audience to know what Marmite is, but it's a yeast spread that some people like and some people hate, and I was glad I explained it, and. But I felt like a lot of the book is about rewriting stories, and to what extent can we actually rewrite? To what extent do we have the power to rewrite stories? I felt this was very true thinking about the Bible, because I hadn't appreciated the extent to which of the synoptic gospels they progressively alter the account of. They tweak things, just like a screenwriter would tweak things, would redraft things, and a story changes, and you think as you adjust the story very slightly, and its significance changes hugely. So if it really does matter, and not because I say so, historically it really does matter that Pilate washed his hands for Jesus' death, and that's a late addition by Matthew that would have been meaningless to. It was a meaningless gesture, and I thought, so I suppose early in the book I wanted to suggest ways that you believe this, but would you also believe it if this, and the funny thing is I do as a reader, I suspend disbelief very willingly, and it's sometimes it's worrying though, isn't it?
But that's exactly it. It's a demonstration of a clear demonstration of how ready we are to accept these things, and of course there is a certain mindset one goes into when reading a novel, but I don't think that's necessarily a mindset that's limited to the novel as well. It's funny, actually, you mentioned earlier about sort of how when you were writing it 4 or 5 years ago, some of the things you're talking about have become much more relevant since. And I just find that fascinating. Actually, when I was reading it, it felt an incredibly contemporary book. I mean, these terms like kind of fake news.
Right. Well, I don't use the word fake news in the book because it didn't exist. When I'm sure I would have been tempted to put it in, but it didn't become. It was when did fake news become? Year before last? Did it? Year before last. Yeah. And I'd handed the book 2016. It was 2016. It was Trump, right? It was 2016, definitely. And I'd handed the book in, and then I handed the book in, and Barack Obama was in office. There was no possibility of Trump being elected. We were going to be Britain was going to be in the European Union for the rest of my adult life. The world seemed a very comprehensible place. I was writing a book about a remote 19th century figure and hoping that some people would see the relevance of his. I thought, well, storytelling is not going anywhere. This is the way we think about things, and I hoped it would have a kind of relevance. I didn't really want it to have as much relevance as it ended up having.
But it does make me wonder if you were kind of maybe unconsciously tapping into something which, because of course Trump didn't just come from nowhere as well. There were kind of factors in our culture that allowed I
think it's an indication that word narrative, that we know that we must have all noticed that word narrative and started using that. Well, we need to change the narrative, which you would never have, you couldn't have said that in 2002 and had any, people would have given you a funny look. And that you need to look at your narrative around your business and think, okay, I think I know what you mean, but that is weird. But now no one would bat an eyelid, and a sort of an awareness that I think an awareness that we can fight over the truth. I don't know whether it's also connected to the internet. I don't know what about the genesis. I'm puzzled about it as anyone.
I do wonder as well, though, if mentioning the internet. I think there are quite a lot of parallels between the epoch we're living through now and the epoch of the late 19th century. Yes. Certainly, post-industrial revolution, Europe had experienced massive technological change, rapid societal change, rapid urbanization. There was, of course, the terrorist threat.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. Well, that I did think was a parallel. That parallel did occur to me because I realised after just a tiny bit of Russian history, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881 by revolutionaries, because, as you know, Russia then was an autocratic society, as it was then, and people wanted to see change, and there was a very aggressive left-wing revolutionary movement who were using terrorism. But so following that, there became a kind of war on terror, part of which was conducted in Paris, and which is why the Russian secret police were so active here, because you couldn't really make it you didn't want to be a Russian revolutionary in Moscow. The secret police would have you. They wouldn't have done not polonium, but something, so a lot of them were in exile in Paris, and so the Russian secret police were here keeping tabs on them. And I thought, wow, isn't that weird? Because you think of the war on terror as a unique phenomenon of our time, and actually to realise that it had a historical antecedent, which isn't, I suppose, the secret Joseph Conrad, the secret agent, it shows you that as well, that these things are sort of a constant, or they've been regrettably. So I did see that parallel was one that I was aware of,
and certainly with the sort of the fake information. So whether it's the protocols, whether it's well, that's the other thing, that fake news has been fake news has been around forever, and I suppose that was the thing about the protocols, that it was. I didn't know the term fake news, but you could see that. There's this contest for people's souls that are being conducted in print, but also in the 1890s, the telegraph is coming in, so information is travelling very, very quickly. There's long distance telephones, transatlantic cable. I mean, a long distance telephone probably meant you could call Brussels rather than but yes, we'd persuade ourselves that we live in a time that's unique in every way, but actually, I was also struck by the continuities between, and I wasn't expecting to see that. And I guess the dispersal of information as well. I mean, there was relatively recently before that they've been able to produce these kind of very cheap daily newspapers as well, so with advances in typesetting and things
that's
like
right. And you know, when you think about the daily newspapers, they're rolling editions through the day. So now we're used to having one newspaper in the morning, but actually it wasn't so different from a website being updated. You'd get a lunchtime edition and an evening edition. So so through the course of the day, you probably would see a story unfolding, not in real time, but still.
Yeah. And then, so there were the protocols, there was the gospel. I think of the character of Leo Taxil as well, who wrote things about the Freemasons and the Catholic Church as well, and there was almost this tradition of literary pranksters is maybe too light a word.
No, that pranksters is right, used, but also it's also something to do with always wanting to know that that our desire to believe that there is to understand things in terms of a story, that's a need, and that we're very rarely satisfied with not knowing or living in doubt. That people believe things because of coherence and because of their comfort with the shape of a story, much more than they are with its factual accuracy. And unfortunately, unscrupulous people can take advantage of that.
We talked a lot about sort of the story itself, but of course, etymologically in English, story and history are from the same root. In French, of course, it's exactly the same word.
Yes.
And one of the things I think you do marvelously in the novel is just to show us how what we think of as history, which I think, when we're all growing up, we're taught sort of, this is what happened, this is the way of looking at things, is actually something which is much more fragile and much more controlled than we are led to believe in our education. And that seems to be sort of a crucial point in the book.
That's the Tolstoy line, that history would be a good thing if only it were true. And I think that Tolstoy anticipates all this. And War and Peace, which I read belatedly, is really, a lot of it is a book about the kind of deception of history, the deception of narrative, that the people who are the least deceived people in the book are people who are sort of have really just in the moment have no real understanding of what's going on, and that history is a battle happens, no one knows what happened, it's unclear who won, but with hindsight everything gets polished and shaped, so you look back and it was only going to turn out that way. And I think one of the things that concerned me was also that did a kind of injustice that makes the decisions people made in the past look sounder and more justified than they ever were, and it understates the amount of luck, good and bad luck, that led to things being the way they are now. And you can see that even whether you follow sports or Brexit or the election of Trump, any of these things which now are concrete facts that historians will write long books explaining why they were inevitable and caused by this, caused by that. If a tiny little adjustment in things would have turned out quite differently, and I think that is so sobering and tragic, actually. Because one of the things that the secret books I was thinking of is that it's the word apocrypha, right? And apocrypha sort of means secret writings, and the apocrypha is the collection of words that don't make it into the canonical Gospels. They're the unauthorized accounts, and you think, well, they contain so much possibilities that were disregarded, or people thought that doesn't fit with the agenda, that doesn't fit with the narrative that we're trying to plug. And you think, what other human possibilities are stored up in those secret books? What other lives might we have led? And I found it's quite a moving thought, really. And I thought we must. It's important to consider that things can be radically different. You don't have to, and it wouldn't take, and it really wouldn't have taken much. I don't think for. Just in the last 2 years since I handed the book in, things could, tiny little adjustments here and there,
And not only could things have been radically different, but also the way things are told can be radically different. And I think that's something which makes the kind of the ideas behind this novel incredibly contemporary as well, is that we're living in a moment where, thankfully, after sort of decades, centuries, millennia of the sort of the historical narrative being controlled by a very limited part of society and part of the world, now there seems to be moves afoot, and hopefully they'll endure, the people who haven't been able to tell their stories before, whether that be women, whether that be people of color, whether that be people from countries which were colonized rather than colonizers. And I think it's fascinating, even over the last 4 or 5 years, the way different stories have been told and the way people are being forced to reflect about what they consider the facts and the stories of history.
Well, when you say that does sound optimistic, but I also see a shadow side of that, which is that people just select the history that they fancy. You know, people just opt out of that you think of culture as being I was thinking, culture as being a kind of a big church. If I don't know, I'm not actually religious. I don't. But it's a space in which we can articulate our disagreements. But we're all in the same space and saying, I think this and that. But then you feel like, well, I don't. Maybe I'm being pessimistic. But maybe I feel like people are just building another space and not talking to the people in this space. I'm just going to have this space and you can have that space, and we're not. The culture got to contain the disagreements and have people, and as you say, and then include more people in the conversation. That's great. But if everyone just like fissile material all splits off and we don't resolve our disagreements in the same space, I feel very gloomy about that.
But it's funny actually, because that sort of that sort of almost level of confusion is one of the sort of the driving forces of the story as well. I mean, I'd like to come back actually to the central character of Nicolas Notovitch, because of course you discovered his work,
yes,
and then you started to learn about
the
man. I mean, was there much written about him? I mean, how did you research?
There's some stuff on archives. I dug up some archival material, and then he had this weird encounter. One of the problems I had was the actual Nicolas Notovitch, and this is one reason I didn't write it as a book of non-fiction, was a much less sympathetic character than the person I present in my book. So the more I found out about the real guy, the more I thought I probably wouldn't have liked this person that much. And I found an account of him in the Imperial. In the archives of the Indian Civil Service. He went and tried to get work. He went to Simla. Around the time he discovered this manuscript, he went and offered to sell secrets to the British government in India, sort of to become a double agent. And so there's this long, weird encounter that was written up by the person who he offered it. And so I found things like that, and I also found this weird book he'd written in Russian, which I don't mention in the book because it was a bit it started to get I really went down a Notovitch rabbit hole, and I wasn't sure. And but he published this book called The Truth About the Jews, which is a very ominous title, I think. But it only exists in Russian. It took me ages to track down a copy, and I found it, and I read it thinking, this is where he and I really part company, because this sounds bad. But actually it wasn't great, but it wasn't as bad. It wasn't the kind of swivel-eyed anti-Semitism. What he was saying made me think more certain that he was Jewish and had converted. And he was suggesting to the Jews en masse that they adopt Orthodox Christianity, and which actually there were practical reasons why that would be sensible if you were Jewish in Russia in the 1880s. The question of freedom of conscience aside, just as a career move, that would have made your life a lot easier. So there was that, and there was Dictionary of National Biography, and then he was in Paris. I knew he was and I found various no one has ever written a book about him, and he did there were big aporia, I think was there were gaps but then I did in the London Library. I found this which blew my mind, and this is because when I started researching the book, Notovitch had about 3 lines on Wikipedia. It's quite a bit longer now, but it's
thanks to you. Did you?
I haven't done it. I hope by osmosis maybe someone's adding stuff. And I found this book in the London Library, and as far as we knew, he hadn't been seen after the Russian Revolution. But this is a book he signed, and he gave it to the Duchess of Kent. Which I think is something about that is very funny, because I always thought he was a social climber, and the idea of him inscribing a copy of his book and trying to press it on a member of the royal family, it seems like the ultimate piece of social crime. It's quite a greasy inscription as well, but it's signed Nicolas Notovitch, 15th of Jan 1939, Paris. And I thought, wow, because I knew he was born in 1858, so that put him in Paris in January 1939. That's the in the sort of Zelig-like way. That's the last place we see him. But thought that was moving as well. Thinking that that a converted Jew in Paris, January 1939. That's not such a great time to be here.
And so, when you were constructing your Notovitch, I mean, as you said, when you found out more about him, you started to find him maybe slightly less sympathetic.
Yes.
Why was it important for you to have a sympathetic Notovitch?
It seems shallow, but I suppose I wanted to have a character I could love, and it's not that I couldn't love. I could love lots of different kinds of characters, characters with a lot of flaws. I needed to be sure that he was not purely motivated by money and acclaim. To me, he was, and I've persuaded myself that he wasn't. So. In my mind now, there's only a cigarette paper between the two Notovitches. But if I think too much about what it said in the the declassified records, I think, well, maybe he was just in it for the money. Which I think, well, what a tiresome person, what tiresome world we'd live in if that was people's abiding motivation.
Well, I mean, certainly the Notovitch we meet is a very complex, a very real character. I mean, sympathetic to a certain extent, and also other moments one maybe might feel slightly less.
He's definitely not. He's not a goody two shoes. He's complex and misbehaves, and which is well. But hands up if you never misbehaved.
But one of the other most compelling characters, of course, is Ratchowski, the head of the Russian Secret Service.
Yes.
In France, and again, I'm just intrigued about your relationship as a writer, like getting to know.
Well, he's absolutely true. Pyotr Ratchkovsky was the head of the Soviet. That's from Freudian fake news. Russian secret police in Paris in the 1880s, and he was this amazing. He's a sort of gift to a novelist, because he was clearly very charismatic, energetic, thoroughly unscrupulous guy who was with his finger in every pie, who was killing people, making money, dabbling on the stock exchange, funneling money from the budget into his mansion, I think he's pretty well accounted for. Although he does also disappear. I give him an afterlife, a post Russian Revolution afterlife. But he also
I had to check that out. Actually,
he disappears. He vanishes. I think in 1917. I think he goes back to Russia in the early part of the 20th century, and then disappears. And
of course, in the novel, it works as a great foil in a way to Notovitch, because obviously each of them are responsible for a forged text.
Yes.
So in Notovitch's case is the gospel.
The unknown life of Jesus Christ.
The unknown life of Jesus, and in Ratchowski's case, the protocols.
Yes.
And it's fascinating because, whereas, of course, the protocols clearly had a malevolent intent.
Yes.
And probably had much more of an effect than Ratchowski would ever have imagined. But still, even the localized effect he wanted to have with them were clearly unpleasant. As you said earlier, the unknown life of Jesus could potentially have been intended as a sort of as a way to nudge history in a slightly different direction. If
you had to take it seriously, if someone stood it up and said, we really have to take seriously the possibility that Jesus studied in Ladakh, or actually the claim is not that he studied in Ladakh, the claim is that he studied in India, but the manuscript was discovered in Ladakh. We'd have to rethink the historical Jesus, and you'd have to see, well, there are Eastern influences, and then also there's this claim about Pilate, that he was the one responsible for. We'll have to reconsider that. It's not till 1962 that the Catholic Church says the Jews must not be considered guilty of Jesus. It takes till 1962. That seems incredible. And so it would have been a conversation people would have been having quite a lot earlier. Who knows what it would have, but maybe it would have been one of those small nudges that would have put the train of history on other tracks.
It does throw up an interesting moral conundrum at the same time. I mean, there's a moment in the book where Notovitch observes that he says history needs a push,
right?
And can you kind of morally use a forgery to push history in a good direction?
I don't know. And actually, when I said history needs a push, I wanted him to be quoting. I considered that to be something that the people's will, the violent revolutionaries would have been saying history needs a push. To me, that's kind of a Leninist view. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, not John Leninist, would have said something else. But the Leninist kind of view that, history's inevitably going this way, and it's our duty to push in that direction, and it doesn't matter how many eggs we break while making that particular omelette. And I felt that was. But he gives a very gentle nudge. Maybe that's the most morally. But I don't know. I don't know. I'm very clear. This is a novel, and he's much less. He's Notovitch. I think this is true of my Notovitch, and the real Notovitch was much more flexible about the line between truth and reality. For me, it's pretty. It's pretty clear. If it's got something that's not true in it, it's fiction. If you think that it's all true, it's non-fiction.
It's kind of, you break the pact between.
Yeah, I think so. Even to the extent that I think when I'm writing journalism, if a travel piece, I don't like to use composite composite. So this, Fred is a composite. You think, well, okay, what else? Yeah, and especially now, we're so alert, we're so worried about what you're being told. When you watch a film now that's based on historical events, you want to be given a handout when you leave the theatre saying, this is true, that's not true. That's important to me.
I could go on talking for hours because it's such a sort of multi-layered book, but I'm conscious there will probably be questions from the audience as well. So if you have a question for Marcel, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear you, and including people who tune into the podcast. The gentleman just there, I think. And then...
Hi, thank you so much. I just discovered your writing and read a little bit of the first of the book. So I'm fascinated with this idea of narratives and stories. And I'm wondering, from a psychological perspective, if you think there's something at the root of all of this need for stories, and especially in the religious sense, that we have this incredible need for security. I spent 16 years living in a Russian Orthodox monastery, and I can tell you the protocols of the Elders of Zion and everything is very, very much still alive.
Really?
There are people, including myself, I never accepted this. I had arguments with other monks about it, but I saw the people who really, really needed it. And there are many stories I did believe and did accept because of my need for security. But after breaking with that, looking back, it's very interesting to see that. But and if you say the Catholics in 1962 sort of disowned this idea about the Jewish blame for the crucifixion, Russian Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox Church never have done that. And there are voices against that. There are voices speaking out. But what do you think is more at the deeper root psychologically that begs for these narratives and begs for the fake news and begs for maybe Trump himself?
It's a really good question. Thank you. Fascinating comment. I think we all. I think it's very painful to live in a world where you really don't understand things, where you feel confused. I think I feel it in myself, the need to smooth reality and come up with stories to live by. I was just thinking when you said that, there's that Jordan Peterson book, Maps to Live By.
Extremely popular among Russian Orthodox.
Really, Maps to Live By, and it's that, and Maps to Live By it does seem like we do need those mythic understandings to kind of and there's a lot of wisdom contained in stories. I think, but you mustn't be. But I think it's important not to be controlled by stories, or to at least to perceive how one is manipulated. That's kind of, I wanted to sort of show the machinery. And if I do break I don't know if it's a fourth wall in a novel, whatever the wall is, it was partly because I thought, well, look, it's machinery. This is how it works. But it's a fascinating question. I don't have an answer.
So just to jump in there, actually, one thing I meant to bring up was there's a moment where you write, you're talking about. It says, in my own life, I've seen history altered by the power of stories, but it was never the likelihood or any positive proof that gave them victory. They understood the power of a simple story. Right. The simpler, the better.
Right. Well, that's definitely true, I think, isn't it? That you just know you know, if you have to explain something complicated like you know, normal distribution or you know, regression to the mean, to make people understand, you know, why people would much rather think the manager went in at half-time, gave them a bollocking, and they went back on the pitch and put 3 goals in the back of the net. It was simple as that. And you think, well, it could be that, it could be regression to the mean, but regression to the mean take too long to explain. It's much, and also it's much nicer to feel like it was a story where a character wanted something, did something, and ended up with a win, lose, or draw. And we are sort of programmed to, I think, to follow stories that have that grammar. This person wants this, they do this, and the result is this. And the best stories have that shape.
And not just to keep being drawn back to sort of Trump and Brexit, but again, both of the campaigns that won there presented the clearest, simplest narratives.
Yes.
Broadly incorrect, but at the same time they were the easiest ones to latch onto.
Yes, and when you say that, I was thinking about, there's a thing Daniel Kahneman says in Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about when you're asked a difficult question, without realizing it, your brain translates the question you don't understand into a simpler question. And I think he calls it substitution. So if you're asked, you know, what do you think about, you know, the net economic benefit of immigration, you don't think, well, this is the pluses and it costs it. You think, do I like immigrants? You know, you don't. You ask them. You substitute a complicated question with which we could spend several months, you know, debating in a mature way. You could, but what you do is you give yourself a really, really simple question and answer that.
Yeah.
Without realizing it.
I think I saw a hand go up over here. No, oh no. Oh yeah, a gentleman at the back there. We'll just run a microphone to you.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the topic of you kind of like when you're talking about non-fiction and doing journalism and never making up a character or creating a kind of a composite of people and stuff like that. And I found this quite interesting, sort of like lately, as I want to know how kind of like deep your feelings on that run, because I worry sometimes with journalism that there's a little bit of an obsession with kind of like, if we can have a quote which kind of affirms a thing, then we can kind of call it true. And in fact, there's, I think, sometimes more space for the kind of like the manipulation of truth through, you know, getting exact facts instead of kind of almost the author kind of like putting themselves on the line. So I don't know if you could sort of like just
no, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, I think it's worse than that. I mean, people actually go to you know, people do set out with a quote in mind, which they then want the person. Because I had a friend who made a documentary about Stephen Hawking, and when Stephen Hawking died, he was rung up by newspapers for quotes, and it was clear that the person who was rung him up had a specific quote in mind. They were and was along the lines of, "Would you say there is a star out there tonight, you know, that is no longer shining on Stephen Hawking?" And he said, "No, I wouldn't say that." But you could see what they were thinking, you know, can you get, you know, this guy to say this? And, you know, I guess it would have been cool if he'd say, yeah, I know, I see, you know, the heavens will never look the same. But, you know, people don't, you know, and of course, sometimes if you write travel, you sort of do want to find the person who says a thing that confirms your assumption about the place. But it's difficult, and the thing about the composite characters, I have to put my hand. I can think of one time I did it, but it was a travel piece, and I just put the quote in the mouth of someone else, and and I still feel a little bit uncomfortable about it.
Just on your questions, well, you made me think of when you read journalism quite often these days, and they'll say reaction on Twitter, and I always think you can find anything on Twitter. Like it seems just such a sort of a lazy journalistic response to sort of.
I think, but I don't think we, you know, isn't that what academic? We sort of look to academics to come, and as a journalist who used to have to call up academics to say things, you know, you would sort of tear your hair out, because they then would say, you know, more research is needed, or on the one hand, you know, they would always have these sort of hedge, and you really wanted someone to say, you know, put things in simple, absolute terms, and that is the devil of the medium, isn't it, unfortunately? But we have to be wise consumers of it as well, as kind of honourable practitioners.
I think we've got time for one more question, if anybody would like to chip in. This lady here.
I can probably just do that, yeah. So I really admire the way you spoke about the story and delving into the history of the man, but then kind of segueing and saying, I need to make this nonfiction. Right. I'm not quite sure. I'm on the path of truth. And besides, maybe I want to change his personality a wee bit. I admire your diligence and your thought through that. But for me, even though I love literature, I am somebody who really takes everything with a grain of salt.
Well, you're right.
I mean, everything, every history book, the Bible, all of it. Because even if you look at the Bible, it was all just written by humans, right? So they're putting their own opinions, their own inflections of what they may have witnessed, and they may think that they're writing history, but they have their own perception as a being. So I find it, I admire your diligence, but I find that it must be very challenging in life to ever really know where to draw the line. Well, because to me, I'm like the line really can't be drawn, because I can't really trust that what I'm reading is 100% true.
Well, that's very interesting, and I think that's true. But I think it's the thing about good faith, isn't it? Someone's trying to tell the truth in good faith. If someone's trying to tell the truth in good faith, you think, well, that's non-fiction. But I think what you describe as admirable conscientiousness to maintain that level of skepticism. But isn't it tiring?
It's tiring. It's like sitting on the wall all the time,
right?
Seeing both sides of the argument.
And I feel
it's interesting. It layers.
But do you find it puts you at a disadvantage to people who will just go, hell for leather to follow a simpler narrative and just say no?
Some people want to be fed the narrative, and some people are happier, I think, being open to the multiple layers of.
But I think it reminds me of the line in The Second Coming, which I always kind of puzzled over, but it seems to me make more sense as I get older, which is that about the Second Coming being having the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I think that's right. Like the best are people, like yourself, who are trying to balance the claims of this against the claims of that, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, maybe they whereas it would be so easy to go, this is the book that I base my life on, this book, and every word of it is true. Then suddenly they would free up a lot of this to do something else.
Like run for president, for example. That is all we've got time for the kind of formal conversational part of the evening. But do stick around, have a glass of wine with us. I'm sure Marcel will be happy to sign copies of The Secret Books, and indeed his other novels, which we also have available at the front desk. I think you are no doubt after this hour what a kind of sort of a complex, interesting, fascinating, but also entertaining novel this is as well, because at base as well it's a story of.
I hope there was an adventure story. I mean,
well, exactly, I mean, there's so many interesting ideas in it that sometimes when you talk about the book, you forget that there's this kind of sort of rollicking,
there's a duel, a horse race. Yeah,
indeed. So I think I can't recommend this book enough. Quite remarkable, and I hope as many of you will be leaving with it as possible tonight. Otherwise, please just join me one more time in giving it up for Marcel Theroux.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.